Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance by voices within the independent Catholic movement. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. And now, meet your hosts, Reverend Dr. Trish Sullivan-Vani and Reverend Dr. Jamie Mathias.
Welcome to Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. I'm Father Jamie Mathias.
And I'm Reverend Trish Sullivan-Vani.
And today we're excited to welcome a special guest, Reverend Trish.
Yes, I think we should say welcome back, a special guest, a friend, and a colleague. Jamie and I are both delighted to be welcoming Father Ricky Manalo, CSP, back to Cutting Edge Catholics. Those of you who hear that name might recognize it. Ricky is a Paulist priest, but he has been a pioneering voice in Catholic liturgy, music, and theology. He's recognized internationally. In fact, those of us who follow him on social media always get a kick out of Ricky is kind of our Carmen Sandiego. You know, where is he right now? And follow him as he travels really to every continent, carrying messages about key issues that are affecting the Roman Catholic Church, but that have an enormous amount of crossover interest. And thus, he is back for a second time on the podcast. He has written about particularly Asian American Catholicism, intercultural relatedness, pastoral leadership. He has a new book out, which grabbed my attention right away. And it is about what do we do around the issue of polarization in this culture. And I'm very excited to be talking about that. You might recall his last podcast with us where we were talking about new media. So he is a man of many gifts. I'm happy to say, Ricky, we just sang Many and Great 2 weeks ago in our community. That will always be first and foremost the way I cherish it, is the gift of music you've given to the church. He is coming to us from somewhere, but usually he's in Midtown Manhattan. So Ricky, welcome. Is there anything I forgot that you'd like to add as we start the podcast off?
No, that sounds great. Presently, I am in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware.
Oh, you poor thing. That must be so hard.
And I am cat sitting a cat, which is now on the piano, looking at me.
All right. It's a musical cat. Well, you know, there are worse places to be in mid-August than on the beaches of Rehoboth. That's the one thing people have asked me, you know, what do you miss about not being in New Jersey, where I was for most of my life?
Mm-hmm.
And I always say going down the shore, and that includes further south into those beautiful beaches along the coast of Delaware. So I'm really happy that you joined us, Ricky. You know, this current book, which is certainly getting a great deal of attention in the Roman Catholic media, is about the way the civic polarization has hit within the church. The title is beautiful. You might want to tell us where that title derives from. It's called Toward a More Perfect Communion. And I think about I think about that scripture where we should, you know, leave our gift at the altar and reconcile with our sibling. I don't think anybody be coming to communion at this point. We're so polarized. So
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about this new book and really like what inspired you to start taking on this question that really is diving into what is the particular Catholic shape of this kind of polarization?
Yeah, I probably began to, thanks for that intro, by the way, Trish. I probably began to reflect on polarization close to 5-6 years ago when I moved to New York. I'm a Paulist priest, and our mother church at 59th Street and 9th, St. Paul the Apostle, it's a wonderful parish. And when I first arrived there, it was really revealing. Within our parish, we had one Paulist priest who started out at St. Paul, you know, a wonderful outreach program to all the LGBTQ plus Catholics in the whole city. And that was 2 pastors ago, and it was a very vibrant community, still is. I mean, Father Jim Martin's part of that. He lives around the corner. But there was also another Paulist priest, and he started, now I'm forgetting the name. It's a very traditional view of LGBTQ. I don't know why I'm forgetting the name, 6 years ago. Anyway, so he was gathering some Catholics, who leaned that way. And me being a sociologist, I began to say, oh, wouldn't it be great to do an ethnographic study of both groups, to find out how both of these LGBTQ Catholics from this broad, or rather from this polarized spectrum, how they view faith per se. And I began to do some interviews in that. And then what happened about 5 years ago, we had pre-assemblies for my Paulist community. Now, every 4 years, my community we gather together every 4 years to talk about the next 4 years. And in our pre-assembly, listening to our parishioners, to our associates, anyone connected to the Paulist community, political polarization came out as number one. And this is, 5 years ago. Of course, it's, because, we Paulists kind of pride ourselves. You want to be able to respond to the signs of the times, right? As coming out of Vatican II. So one of the strongest resolutions that came out of the assembly is that we should create a Paulist initiative on polarization. And me having begun this work, I said I'd love to be part of that. I'd love to lead it. Actually, I was actually part of the council at the time, so I kind of took that baton. And what winded up happening, we created this what we used to call the Paulist Initiative on Polarization. For the first 2 years, I got together a super committee, and we had a summit on polarization 2.5 years ago, Las Vegas of all places. And it was great. We chose Las Vegas because Las Vegas is a red and blue state. The Archbishop there welcomed us. And I gathered 100 Catholic leaders together from this whole spectrum from red and blue, on and everyone in between. Probably the highlight of that gathering, it was for 3 days, was this event where for the first time I gathered both editors from the NCRs, the NC Reporter, National Catholic, and the NC National Catholic Register. They had never been in a panel because, as we might talk about, media exacerbates polarization, deepens it. And so that was probably the biggest highlight of that. But it was also, 100 leaders coming together and say, how do we just find common ground, without resorting to the toxicity, or what we call affective polarization, and come up with more pastoral tools. What came out of that then, I began to write this book, Toward a More Perfect Communion. Of course, it's a play on the Constitution, U.S. Constitution, Toward a More Perfect Union. I put communion, which is very Catholic, as you know, kind of suggesting what might be a particular, Christian Catholic perspective on this issue, and how might our Catholic tradition actually bring us together, because, it's always been there. It's been our tradition, which my book shows. But apply that to the present context that we're experiencing, not only in the country, but within our own church.
Father Ricky, what a delight to have you with us here again. I am loving reading your new book, Toward a More Perfect Communion, Catholic Wisdom for a Polarized Age, and all of our listeners can get 25% off by visiting the Paulist Press website with the code PERFECT. I have to ask you, Father Ricky, when we think of polarization, we think of it often in terms of political terms, but it just seems that polarization is also a very deep theological and spiritual challenge as well. Wondering if that's something you might be able to address, and also be able to link the two and to be able to help us to understand, is it the political polarization that fuels the spiritual and theological polarization, and or vice versa, and or is it some sort of doom loop that the two of these get into and start feeding one another?
Yeah, I think it's both, and they're all interconnected. But first, to look at that first question you asked about polarization. So there are various, I guess, subcategories of polarization. In and of itself, let me just start with this one term, polarization. That's not bad per se. In fact, our country has always been polarized in a sense because we primarily have a two-party system. Not everyone is red and blue. We have a lot of independents too, but primarily it's a red and blue political system. And we've always been able to actually, work out our differences up until maybe the 1980s. But then there were various types of polarization. The first one I talk about is what we would call ideological polarization. And that's when we begin to categorize left, right, conservative, traditional, or progressive, and liberal, whatever that may be. Political polarization, that's because of the two-party system. What this book addresses, and this is where it's getting into the Catholic Christian context that we're talking about, but then we have two other categories. That's going to be affective polarization and toxic. Affective is when those divisions begin to affect our relations, per se, mistrust. We begin to judge other people by what they believe, simply because of what they believe. That's when we're going to get into, I think, moral issues, per se, because it's one thing to say, oh, you voted for so-and-so. That's fine. That's how we've always been, looking at these issues. But not only have you voted for the other person, but because of that, ... You can fill in the glass with negative, images, connotations, mistrust. The next, and this is the last kind of I want to talk about, is what we call toxic polarization. That's not only about mistrust and not being able to have conversations with one another. For example, think about Thanksgiving dinners with families or within your own communities when we can't even do that. Toxicity is when it actually gets so toxic that even at a point today, we begin to have violence toward other people. In fact, even assassinations we've been experiencing, right, the last couple of years, just because of political ideology and political affiliation. So in my understanding, this is when we get into what this book is about, those are deeply moral issues. And I would even call them sin. Somehow there's a social sin going on. And so how does that violate many of the Catholic social teachings, that surround dignity of the other person, no matter what the other person believes, or common ground, or common good that we all share. Those are the issues. That's when they begin to intersect, when it gets into the deeply more personal moral issues that affect society and actually our own faith, the way we view the body of Christ, the way we're able to celebrate and worship together despite our differences.
I'm thinking as you're talking, Ricky, about how I hold our current polarization. I was thinking, for the most part, I've been kind of holding it like it's a phenomenon of the past 10 years, like that it's acute in the last 10 years. But the truth is, it's been going on for a long time. It's been escalating for a really long time. I think back to when I was a young teen and when Ralph Reed and the Christian Coalition emerged. And that's what I think of that as kind of a landmark moment of increasing red-blue polarization, increasing arguments about moral truths and who had the correct answer and all of that. And I know in your book you actually go back, 75 years to talk about the arc of getting into this, what I do think we're in, a really toxic situation now. Tell us a little bit about how you think we got to this, both secularly or if you prefer within the church.
Sure. So it's always been building about, as you mentioned, I kind of pin it, at least in the modern time right now, for 75 years. Ultimately, we can go back to the Civil War as far as the country, and even to the Constitution, when you talk about, the issue, the Declaration of Independence, when you think about, how the question of slavery divided Congress, per se. Now, within more public Roman Catholic perspectives, in the 1960s, you have so many things, like anything today, it goes back to the 60s, converging, right? You had a lot of Catholics, for example, participating in the civil rights movement. Some of them marching along, the African Americans. Others not not participating, including bishops, or being complacent in the review. But then when you had then the first Catholic president, right? Kennedy becomes president. So all of a sudden, Catholicism and Catholics are beginning to see themselves in the public sphere. But then in 1962, you had Congress pass no prayer, allowed in school. So, and not just Catholics, but I just want to speak from that perspective. So all of a sudden we have a Catholic presidency, we're out in the public, but then we can't voice our faith in public, and then later on in that decade, you have things like Humanae Vitae, right, going on. So all of these moral issues are affecting Catholics at a time when Vatican II is happening. Vatican II is also going to be divisive in some ways, right? Because it's going to call for, your own language, for example, or cultural styles and music. All of these things will erupt. Some people will see that as advancing, progressively toward the vision of what came out of the council. But then then when so many Catholics disagreed with Humanae Vitae, they're beginning to see a polarized arena, both at the civic and the Catholic, at least official statements. And then, of course, abortion would further that. In the 80s and 90s, you'll have what we would call the cultural wars, right, coming about, when all of a sudden we have this image that we have to kind of pick sides. A lot of traditional Catholics, well, for the first time, kind of aligned with fundamental Christians, march in their, right to life, all of us, and for the first time is bringing those together. But then you have other Catholics kind of looking at racism or economic justice for all, or these issues. And slowly and surely, all of these various components for Catholics who are engaged in the civic sphere will begin to they'll begin to experience their own divisiveness, they're called Catholic identity, but then also having to choose. And then, of course, another layer, and I can't get into that now unless you want me to, is media and how that winds up, further cementing, ideological binaries, per se.
Father Ricky, I'd love to return to that topic of media, but before that, I'd like to challenge you to step even farther back in time. And I'd like to do that by drawing our listeners' attention to the initials behind your name, CSP, the Congregation of St. Paul. I'm wondering, Father Ricky, what lessons or wisdom we might gain from two principal sources that might be dear to your heart. One, the legacy of St. Paul and the Christian scriptures, but also your own the history of your own congregation, the Congregation of St. Paul. From my understanding of Isaac Hecker, the founder of your congregation, back in the 19th century, he lived in a rather divided time too. It wasn't exacerbated by all the social media and the media that we have today, but I'm recalling how it is that, for instance, conservatives referred to him as the yellow dart. I mean, it strikes me that there was this us versus them mentality that he was fighting against himself. And as a convert to Catholicism, it just seems that there's various wisdom that we could get from those two sources, both from St. Paul, but also from Isaac Hecker and the Paulist fathers that he gave birth to. Any insights into that, Father Ricky?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, my community was founded around 1858, so it's coming out of the Civil War. And as America is still trying to, even though the Civil War occurred, the polarization continued, of course, right? As even with the restoration of the South, even when the Northern troops left, that would again peak when with the Civil Rights Movement. So we have this period where racism, as I would call it, is actually, in some ways, arguably the first polarization issue in the country, and Catholics were part of that. Some Catholics participated in that, as Pope Leo, recently said in his encyclical in AI. He kind of apologizes for that. Some would say it's kind of, wow, it's kind of late in some ways. But his apology was, I just want to kind of qualify that he was saying that if we're going to engage in the civic discourse, we have to own our own skeletons per se. When it comes to AI, let's first own what we've done per se. So, but his point was that, and my point as well, is that Catholics and all people who were living in this country were always, were always living in a time where racism was kind of the underlying, area. And of course, me being Asian American, all issues of racism, right? Not just African Americans per se. So the Paulists were always one who wanted to, as a community, Congregation of St. Paul, we wanted to respond to those areas per se. We were the first community to be founded by an American. Up until that point, every other community, from Franciscans to Jesuits, were European imports. So being the first male community, I should say, I think Elizabeth Ann Seton founded her community like 4 years before we did. We have a very American worldview, however you define American per se. Isaac Cook once said, and I begin my book with this, that I could be a better Catholic by being American, and I could be a better American by being Catholic. He himself, along with the first 5 of our founders, were Protestant, and then they converted to Catholicism. So they're experiencing all of this, and they're trying to bring in the Catholic faith in the work of evangelization, in the work of preaching, in the work of their mission within this particular U.S. context per se.
Well, as someone who has an undergraduate degree in American Studies and spent a lot of time in the world of ecclesiology and history, and one of the things that I think a lot of us, need to have our lights turned on about, is that you can never be studying the church unless you're looking at the culture. They're in such a dance with each other, right? That's a very Hecker's statement was quite radical for the 19th century. I mean, that was a time that Catholics were very marginalized and continue to be marginalized really right up to the 50s. We have a sort of limerence now that does not, an amnesia in a way of what the American Catholic experience has been like since before the country was founded. I keep thinking about that when it was on my mind as we dialed in, and I commented earlier about this whole idea of leave your gift at the altar. We use the word communion constantly. That's one of our the source and summit of our lives and our experiences, the Eucharist, and we're always talking about communion. And it really has given me pause to think, am I being really self-honest about what it takes to truly have an authentic Eucharist? So I'm thinking of a story that I heard at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley from some young Rwandan seminarians in training who told the story of their local priest after the genocide. And the Hutus and the Tutsis were still in tremendous hatred toward one another. And he said to the community in this village, there will be no Eucharist until we've reconciled this. And they fasted from the Eucharist for quite a long time. I want to say well in excess of a year, and grieved and reconciled and worked on this terrible fracture. And then when this young man with tears in his eyes was telling us about, he was like a youngster at the time, what it was like for everyone to come back to the Eucharist, that they really understood it as communion, right? So, I just think that the Eucharist should be challenging us, right?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I devote some parts of, looking at Catholics and liturgy per se. And again, what I discovered is that we have contested strands going on when it comes to polarization. At one level, for example, there is a lot of unity going on when we celebrate the Eucharist. The best example I always say is, when when we invite them to share the sign of peace, we might turn towards someone to the left, right, or behind us or in front of us, and at that moment when we're exchanging that peace, it doesn't matter who that person voted for. In fact, we might not even know, or we might even know, it might be family members, and yet we still genuinely are honest, and we want to say, yes, peace be with you, per se. Of course, they're sharing a communion as a sign of that unity. And in some ways, that's the power of good symbol, right? That's a power of good ritual that reminds us what we ought to be doing, along with good preaching, that makes us better disciples once we leave, the church building, per se. At the same time, my colleague Tricia Bruce, a wonderful sociologist, and Maureen Day, I think from GTU and other good, a lot of their studies also show how, even the Eucharist can still be a site of divisiveness. Tricia Bruce has done a lot of studies showing how, and this is interesting, how more and more Catholics are choosing particular parishes that, of course, politically align with their own, ideologies, per se. And we know this from various studies. In fact, people, not just Catholics, are actually moving across state lines because of political ideology, which at one level is kind of disappointing, because good democracy actually happens when you have various opinions coming together and coming out with a common good, whatever that may be. But the more we're sorting ourselves, even within Catholic parishes, the more there could be a danger, actually, the deeper the danger of not really learning the wisdom from the other. I want to believe, and I still do, that all various perspectives has something truthful to share for the common good. Not everything from all sides, but everyone has something to share, because somehow, I want to believe there's an experience there or interpretation that might actually be fruitful in dialogue and conversation. When we begin to lack those opportunities, and more we've been experiencing that for the past couple of decades, then polarization becomes even more acute and more binary and more, as we were talking about, affective and toxic.
Father Ricky, I have two simple questions on my mind that arise when I think of communion, but one also involves moral theology. And so I'm wondering if any of the research that you did as part of your new book, Toward a More Perfect Communion, Catholic Wisdom for a Polarized Age, might help our listeners who grapple with questions like these. The first question deals more with communion, and it is the simple question of, how can we love those whose politics frighten us? That would be the first question. How to love those whose politics frighten us. I know that personally, there is someone who is very, very dear to me, whose politics I just find a little troubling, and it has been a little difficult. I am needing to love this person more than ever, and really challenge myself to accompany this person through this time. That's the first question. The second question has more to do with moral theology, and that is, what if we're right, Father Ricky? That is to say, communion requires dialogue, but sometimes we hear calls for dialogue and we think, but what if we're actually right? What if the other side's position is genuinely harmful? How do we practice communion without pretending that every disagreement has moral equivalencies? So how are those two questions about being frightened and also what if we're right?
Yeah, I hear those are great questions, and they're interconnected. I hope I don't forget that interconnection when I speak now. About the first question, more that personal, relational, intercultural, or relationship you might have with either friend or loved one or family or partner, whatever that may be, who that may be. One of the first things, if I was to give you like a kernel of something I want you to remember, part of it is the first lesson is how can we stay with that conflict and be resilient to it. My colleague Bob Bodone wrote a wonderful book about this, conflict resilience. We don't like conflict. As soon as we hear someone has a different, we don't know, we don't want to stay because it's ugly, it's uncomfortable. And this whole book is dedicated to that's okay. How can we stay with that, and and just work through that, see grace in all of these various aspects, and learn to actually appreciate differences. But if there's one advice I'd like to give concerning this first question, learn more about the other person's perspective. It's so easy for us to, I still do this myself, to right away, if they share an opinion about a political or moral belief, we want to right away perhaps share our own, opinion right away. And it's so difficult to resist going into that space right away. That's what I'd like to offer. One of the best things you can do, if you're able to, with the grace of God, is ask him or her, tell me more about that. Learn about why they believe that. If they're a close friend, even better. You can say, you might even go deeper, say, is there something about your childhood? Or was there an event in your life that led you to believe what you believe? And then once we get into this narrative space, right, where we begin to share stories, it doesn't become about opinionated discourse, but it becomes about story sharing. Oh, yeah, they might share, oh, yeah, well, my parents taught me, this, or I had an event when I was a teenager, or I had, or maybe in my 20s, this, find out why. And then once you begin to learn, it doesn't mean you have to agree. That's one of the first dispositions I also want to state. When you have these conversations, we shouldn't actually be threatened by our own political or ideological stance. Actually, when you have conversations like that, studies actually show that it actually fortifies what you believe. Because then my opinion, right or incorrect, whatever it may be, becomes fuller, right? It becomes a fuller context, and I could kind of own that within this more complex context or narrative that we might be receiving from media or from around, from other people. So that's the first part. Learn more. And then once you get that space, hopefully, if it goes well, then you could share your own story, why you believe what you believe. Now, I want to make one qualification before we go on to that. Do that, but only to the extent that the other party or person is able to have a fruitful conversation. If it gets a little scary, or they're not respecting you, or there might be, then I say this is not the time. You don't. In other words, try to make inroads to that conversation. But if you're being abused verbally, right, leave or say this perhaps another time. But ultimately, you want to get to that space when you can share stories and just learn about the other person. That was a long answer to your first question. I think you had another one.
I love it, Father Ricky. That's helpful. And the second question is, what if we're right? When we find ourselves in disagreement with people, they're not moral equivalencies. Some views are actually harming human beings.
Right. And and that might be truth. But then my experience, I'm going to share you my experience. They also believe in the truth. They also believe that they're right, and so there's nothing wrong with holding on to your conviction. Like that's what I was saying before. Ultimately, in a conversation or dialogue, if your position actually gets fortified after such faith, story sharing, then even better per se. So yeah, it's not a question of whether you were correct or wrong. It's a question of how might there be some kind of common ground to the extent that we can at least see some similarities and, as I was saying before, treat each other with Christian love and all of those areas without necessarily changing my opinion or trying to change the other person's opinion. As we know, by the way, that last point, it never works. When you just try to change a person's opinion with these discourses opinions, it, for the most part, maybe my experience at least, maybe 10% of my times I've done that, they might have seen another perspective, but they actually might still hold on to their thoughts per se. So it's not about finding that as a goal. The last thing I do want to say is that sometimes, and I don't know how this fits in, sometimes injustice is just injustice, and the prophetic voice needs to speak up. But that could be from multiple sides, my experience. And
Mhm.
it's not that I might be wrong. It might entail me to actually be more vocal because of my own identity, because of my own background, my story, whatever that may be, to actually be more proactive per se. But you're going to find the same perspective and conviction from other perspectives. So it's not about deleting that, but just finding some kind of common ground where the conversation and dialogue could continue.
Okay, so this is pulling for us to talk about media
Yeah, yeah.
because, okay, so I have someone in my life who I love deeply, whose home a certain extremely conservative cable news channel is on all day from dawn till bedtime and in every room of the house so that
That's
you never have to miss the feed.
yeah.
And uh, Catholic talk radio is on in the car constantly. So I'm visiting this beloved person, and I needed a phone charger. So right next door to the restaurant we were going to is this place to pick up the phone charger. So I get the keys, and I'm just going to drive this short distance to run over and get a phone charger when I am listening to this radio that's on where the commentator is berating a young mom
Mm.
because she has not as yet baptized her 2-year-old, and doesn't she understand that if that child dies, it will go to hell?
Mm.
And I almost drove off the road. I got so worked up. So this is the milkshake that my beloved is drinking, right? And then I have, news sources that they will never encounter that I'm watching.
Yeah.
And so talking, even listening gets so hard
Mm.
when the media it's not like back in like when in the 70s when my father was watching Walter Cronkite, and we were pretty sure that Brinkley and others and Roger Mudd on the other major stations were delivering the same news,
Yes.
right? What do we do? And also in the plethora of media we consume,
Mm.
I mean, who would have dreamed we'd all be walking around with a supercomputer in our pocket, right? You
That's
know?
true. Yeah. And
So
then, of
I
course,
I I
yeah.
can't resist going there for a little bit. What do you think?
Yeah, yeah, and those are great points. And of course, like, yeah, social media too, right? Because Facebook could get my algorithm. All of a sudden, I'm getting this advertisement or these, oh, you might be interested in these friends per se. And unless I check their background, I'll say, oh, sure. So that just continues to grow. Yeah. So in the world of media, um, historically, first, I want to say that part of what came out of the 1960s, they realized that media and arts could also have political influence, right? So in the 60s, Joan Baez and Bob Dylan could sing a song that could go on the radio that has political ramifications or implications. So there's always been this um, interrelated dynamics between political, media, arts, and faith per se. And of course, as you've already mentioned, by the time you get to now, with social media and the plethora of various degrees. Um, so at one level, one of the things I like to suggest, and I do this in the book, is what Amanda Ripley, who's a reporter, calls how do we challenge ourselves, beginning with ourselves, to what she says complicate the narrative, right? Complicate the narrative. I could, for example, when something happens that's going on at the civic arena and it somehow affects my faith, I go to my preferred news media per se. But then I also try to complicate the narrative of that. I'll begin to look at news media resources from other perspectives or the other side per se. Dot, dot, dot. to the extent that the other media resources are speaking, in my estimation, truth, and to have good intentions. So in other words, I will intentionally look at other media. There are some I'll avoid because in my estimation, they're just not speaking. They're interpreting truth totally different from my understanding of what truth is. I might go to the Associated Press, for example. Have you seen the media bias chart? It's a wonderful chart that kind of shows, this one clearly is to the right, this one clearly is to the left. It doesn't actually talk about it doesn't actually talk about whether they're accurate or not, because I could be in the far left media or far right, and my reports could actually be accurate per se. But the media bias is actually showing what kind of stories are they presenting per se. I usually like to go to like Associated Press or Newsweek just to get other perspectives. There are also, like the New York Times, for example, they have some writers who are writing for the New York Times, but they skew to the other perspective. I'll read it because to me they're kind of like educated. I don't want that to sound elite, but it's an informed understanding of their opinions per se, and that'll kind of open my eyes to or I'll do the opposite. I'll read stories, about how people might react. There are a lot of news articles that just talk about people without doctorate degrees, just what they do devotionally when this breaks out. So that just complicates my narrative. I'm still able to, like I said before, hold on to my opinion per se. But yeah, I think we've gotten into a time when algorithms, AI, as we talked about in our last podcast, can right away addict people to particular one perspective per se. And that's a shame. That arose maybe around the 1990s, actually, when they realized in the political arena, media matters, So that's the challenge I always try to say. How do we complicate our narratives while still holding on to what we believe?
Father Ricky, I really appreciate your addressing the media, only because the example that I would cite is that I recently discovered that the White House has launched a new website on media offenders and leftist influencers, which just, in my mind, cements this polarization, of this we versus them mentality that we as a church have a serious moral obligation to try to overcome. Father Ricky, my next question deals with two thoughts, and I wonder if we might be able to draw possible lessons from these two fields. Now that you're writing and researching communion and have published your new book, Toward a More Perfect Communion, Catholic Wisdom for a Polarized Age, if there are any lessons that we might gain from synodality and or from intercultural liturgy with respect to deeper communion. That is to say, synodality seems to be a word that has risen in popularity during these past few years. I dare say that in my 10 years of formation, I don't think I ever once heard the word synodality. So perhaps I'm wondering if there are lessons from that more recent concept for greater communion, more perfect communion, but also intercultural liturgy. You've been writing on this for quite some time, and it just seems that there is something that we might be able to learn from the fact that we as Catholics for a long time now have been bringing folks together from very different backgrounds to be able to celebrate the Eucharist together. Thoughts?
Yeah. So about synodality, I think I'm bad in my memory. I think my 5th chapter is all about the synodality that Pope Francis started. Yeah, that's a global, and I put that there because that's a global approach or ecclesial perspective of how Pope Francis essentially wanted to. It's not so much it's not like a Vatican III as most people were thinking of, but rather how do we just kind of review our paradigm of what the church is, right? So this is a way of being church, and he brings in synodality as a way of learning how to listen better, not just to one another, and this is where the Christian perspective comes in, but more so to the Holy Spirit, right? So what came out of this, and this a lot of dioceses and parishes using this, what we call conversations in the spirit. There were moments in the dialogue. I don't know if you've experienced this, but there's a whole paradigm of how we dialogue and have conversations, where there were intentional moments of just silence. Where before, we might picture dialogue like you go and then I go or another person goes, but then there were these pauses where we intentionally welcome the Spirit to honor what the other person said or shared. Let the Spirit open our minds, whether we agree or not, per se, and then bring that into prayer. So in some ways, what the Synod of Synodality, and particularly that tool, Conversation in Spirit, is that it kind of baptizes, puts Christian meaning into specific psychological approaches to conversations, which has, I think, a wonderful format, particularly in the faith tradition. Your second question, intercultural liturgy. Yeah, that's how I kind of felt. I mean, I've been doing that since the 1990s. So when polarization came through, I didn't say this in my history, it was, in some ways, it was a natural continuation between what's going on in interculturality and in intercultural communication and liturgy. It's the same idea. A lot of the things has to do with how do we see this common ground where we begin to recognize the various cultural gifts that each group or community shares and brings into this larger ecclesial space of church, or in this particular idea of worship. Worship itself and liturgy, and intercultural liturgy, is, in some ways, symbolic metaphors we were talking about, as I was talking about with Trish before, that gives us, that imbues us perhaps with worldviews. It resets our understanding of what we ought to be doing once we leave, that sacred time together. Interculturality and intercultural worship was this way of honoring all the various cultural gifts that make up the body of Christ, not just by race and ethnicity. It might be generational. In this case, it might be political ideology that we bring around this. So what came out of that was a lot of resources since Vatican II that talked about how that process could be, how we could be better attuned to the process of honoring and respecting other people's perspectives, per se.
Yeah,
I want to make one last thing. That's that multicultural liturgy, intercultural liturgy. That's always been in our church's history since day one, 2,000 years ago. I also believe that 2,000 years from now, this side of the Parousia, what do you mean by that? This side of the time when before the second coming of Christ, we'll still be looking at issues of unity and diversity, except it'll be different questions. In other words, unity and diversity was here 2,000 years ago. It'll be here 2,000 years from now, this side of Jesus' second coming. But how we define diversity will be probably much more complex, much more nuanced. But that's always going to be a component, I believe, in church life. Hopefully, unity will always be there, but also, sharing our diverse gifts and our identities, all of that will always be there.
Yeah, what we now call the Council of Jerusalem would never have been convened if everybody's getting along so great. Okay, so you mentioned conversations in the spirit and being outside the Roman Catholic system. I'm going to have to look into that because I'm very intrigued. But before we turn to our cutting edge Catholics questionnaire, which we never want to miss, I'm curious if you have anything you'd offer those of us who are pastoral leaders in terms of what kind of practices could we be bringing to our faith communities of, I don't know, listening, prayer, dialogue that would help people soften up and be a little bit more willing to do the kind of mutual listening you're speaking of.
Yeah, that's a great question because, the last part of my book, the last third per se, is all about pastoral ministry. Like what is, I talk about the history and then I look at what are the church traditional, from scripture to sacraments to Catholic social teaching to synodality, but I kind of put that in conversation with what are some civic leaders doing? At the civic, what might we do to reform? Some civic practices that's leading to that's exacerbating polarization. The last third is based. I say, putting this all together, I say, well, what does this mean for the parents? What does this mean for the guardians or for pastoral leaders, for preachers, for example, for educators, etc. And what I do is once I get the all of the genius and gifts of what the Christian tradition offers with the civic insights, I come up with this. I kind of do a cross reference and come up with these 5 movements, and they are encounter, discern, reconcile, accompany, and witness. So those 5, encounter, discern, reconcile, accompany, witness, I then apply to various pastoral roles, including leaders. Part of that is, let me just talk about the first one, encounter. This is, again, it's a very Pope Francis, because he was kind of the one who popularized this idea of how we encounter various cultures. When we encounter other people, for pastoral leaders, that's about being present, right? We might meet people, we might think our parish or congregation might be one particular political ideology, or both, or mixed, whatever it may be. But then when we encounter someone who is, who kind of might be different than our own perspective, or might not be part of the majority of a particular community, the pastoral leader is meant to just be present to that person, right? I always want to say, too, never assume that everyone out in your parish or congregation is one political ideology. A lot of Catholics actually occupy what I would call this third space, actually. That, political ideology, left, right, they might not actually identify with red and blue. They're just looking at their own faith perspective. So the context of our pastoral ministry, we have to assume is always going to be complex. Even then, there might be 1 or 2 or 3 or 5% that might be different than the majority of the people in front of me. We also have to ask, how are we reaching out to them, or are we alienating them? Which is not an easy discernment. While we have to also speak truth, what you were talking about, JB, to where the community is leading. The next part I was talking about is discern. When moments like that happen, I always try to say resist to the degree that it is not, as we were talking about before, that it's not grossly violating an inherent justice issue of human rights or dignity of the human person, but try to resist coming up with decisive decision making until we first learned about the complexity of a situation. I don't know if that's making sense. Usually we have our own convictions, and that's part of where preaching and pastoral leadership, at times prophecy, prophetic preaching and prophetic leadership is needed. So I'm not putting that away. But at the same time, look for moments when we need to also recognize the complexity of all the people there who may not share our views. How might you find their stories, and how might that lead to a deeper discernment as to what your role is as a leader? The other thing I could talk about, but I don't want to get too far, but I've been ultimately pastoral leaders are meant to be reconcilers, which is it's a very Christian ideal. So in some ways you are the leader of reconciliation, right? So how what does that look like? How do you bring people together? Might there be, during election time, for example, might there be a time when you have, before election day, you have an evening prayer, or that's centered around peace, that's centered around a lot of the Catholic social teachings of common good, things like that, or just pray for the intercessions. Talk about bring in for peaceful elections. Don't talk about who to vote for. You should never do that. But that's your role as reconciler. There has been bishops in the past, as we know, they would actually blatantly tell people how to vote. Even the U.S. bishops have said officially they should never do that. The last two, how do you continually accompany them? Are you able to walk with them? If you say something that might be prophetic, and again, there might be a need for that, Do you just end it with your after you preach and this I don't want to talk to anyone? It's easy to do that because we're in such a privileged, powerful position. But accompaniment means someone might come up to us, and we get this all the time for preachers. They might start criticizing you because they were hurt or they don't believe what you do, and we might instinctively want to dismiss them. But how are you staying there? And then how do we kind of walk with them, listen to their stories, as I said before? And the last thing I want to say is just doing all of that by example, being a witness, right? For me, depending on the pastoral context and where I perceive my community to be, I usually want to be seen as a reconciler. That might not favor one or the other, or actually show that things are actually complex, for example, that may appear. And then by my example, by witnessing to that gospel truth, that does more than any kind of political discourse I might do at the AMBO. Just by your example, because you give your political discourse at an AMBO, again, depending on your context, that's not going to reconcile per se. I don't know whether 10 minutes, 50 minutes is the time to do that when you're preaching. If you do that, there might be something maybe Wednesday evening. Let's have a conversation about the upcoming elections from various perspectives. It doesn't have to be a battle or debate. It could just be sharing stories. As I was saying before, the narrative approach without any, and there are different tools, the Communion Project, the organization that I now co-direct. Braver Angels is a national organization that does this. You can find tools and speakers who can actually come in and know how to do that skillfully. So it doesn't resort to debate. Actually, most of the time when people come to those, they don't really want debates. They actually find common ground already because they see how toxicity is affecting their lives and their spiritual faith.
Father Ricky, so greatly appreciate your sharing concrete suggestions for those of us who are interested in working toward greater reconciliation, more perfect communion in such a divided age. Just really, really appreciate that. Father Ricky, we've come to the time in our episode where we have what we call our Cutting Edge Catholics Questionnaire, a set of 10 rapid-fire questions. We've called this our Cutting Edge Catholics Questionnaire Perfect Communion Edition. Are you ready for this, Father Ricky?
I forgot about this from the last. I wish this is good. I didn't have a time to rehearse, but we did this in the last podcast, right?
There you go. There's no rehearsal, Father Ricky. You just say the first thing that comes to your mind, and it better helps us to get to know you, but also to get to know the ideas that are contained in your new book, Toward a More Perfect Communion: Catholic Wisdom for a Polarized Age. Ready?
Okay.
Here we go. Question number 1, Father Ricky. One word that describes the America's political climate.
Toxic.
One word that describes the American Catholic Church.
Contested.
Conviction or compromise?
Ooh, I don't like it. Well, I guess I lean towards conviction.
Prophetic witness or bridge building?
I'm a bridge builder.
Father Ricky, synodality in one word.
Holy Spirit. That's two, but it's a two term.
The Catholic virtue most endangered by polarization.
Catholic virtue most endangered. Unity.
The gospel passage you would prescribe for polarized Catholics?
The Samaritan woman, the woman at the well, two cultures coming together, and yet at the end, unity.
The Catholic social teaching principle most relevant to polarization.
Human dignity.
One thing all Catholics should start doing?
Complicating their narratives while holding on to their prophetic conviction.
Amen. And finally, the last question, Father Ricky. Complete this sentence. A more perfect communion begins when?
Begins when I become open to allowing the Spirit to trust various encounters before me and the dignity of the person with whom I converse.
Thank you, Father Ricky, for your willingness to participate in our Cutting Edge Catholics Questionnaire Perfect Communion edition. And now, Father Ricky, we've come to the time in our episode when we tend to share some final thoughts. If you don't mind, I'll jump in first, and then I'll kick it over to Reverend Trish, and then we'll give you the final word as we close out today. I just want to say, Father Ricky, that I was in elected office here in Austin, Texas, with a district of 55,000 voters from 2012 to 2020, and I just saw up close and personal a real change in rhetoric and conversation around 2015, 2016. And it was just an absolute fascinating thing to see this breakdown of civility and this increase in polarization. And so I really, really appreciate that there are persons like yourself who are willing to wrap some thought around what it is that we as Christians and Catholics and people of faith and just good folk here in the U.S. who are interested in this topic, what is it we might do instead of allowing ourselves to be pulled apart, to find ways for us to continue coming back together. We have believed for so long, e pluribus unum, from many one. It seems that it's time for us to be thinking about that oneness, that unity that all of us share. So really, really appreciate your new book in that respect. I have begun reading it. I can't wait to finish reading it because I think the image that sticks in my mind is this White House list of media offenders. It seems that there could easily be as well a list of offenders to more perfect communion, and I pray that none of us ever does or says anything that might offend the more perfect communion toward which all of us are called. So thank you, Father Ricky. Love having you. Reverend Trish?
Well, this has been amazing. I think we could have kept you on for another 2 hours, Ricky, but this also just feels like the perfect synthesis of so many of the threads you've been weaving for so long, right? So, I think about all the ways in which you helped us pray well. I think of all the ways in which you've written and been an activist for us not seeing ourselves as fractured communities under multiple communities under one roof culturally, but grouped together. All the work you've done on new media and how that's impacting us and our planet. And so it's just really powerful because I do think on some level there is an accountability that we all have as Catholics to this issue. A fundamental accountability that Christianity in general calls us to it, to heal the body, to remember we're one body. I mean, Jamie referenced the Pauline theology earlier, so I'm just really grateful to have had this time with you, and excited to read the book, and excited to bring it forward to my community as a resource. But we always let our guests have the last word. So is there anything else you'd like to share?
No, just deep appreciation to what you're both doing. We were talking about media and how media can contribute and deepen our divisions. But the fact that you have me on here, you kind of, we need more podcasts, more media resources like what you're both doing, because that's, in some ways that's a positive way of combating this, through our own, Catholic ideals, that you're both doing, those principles. You're kind of modeling that for us, and so I just want to thank you for this opportunity, and deep appreciation that you may continue to do this with the guidance of the Holy Spirit. God bless.
Thank you, Ricky. So we've come to a close. Listeners, viewers, thank you so much for spending time with us and with our good friend, Reverend Dr. Ricky Manalo, an amazing teacher, I will add. His new book, Toward a More Perfect Communion, Catholic Wisdom for a Polarized Age, can be purchased directly from Paulus Press. And if you put the word perfect in the code box, you will get a 25% discount. So we hope that you'll grab that book and spend some time with it. Our moment has come to begin to prayerfully repent of the ways in which each of us has participated in this terrible fragmentation. Thank you all for joining us for this episode of Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of resistance, reconstruction, and renewal. My name is Reverend Trish Sullivan-Vani.
And I'm Father Jamie Matthias.
And we thank you for joining us, and we invite you into this chapter of healing to which we've all been invited.
Thank you for joining us for Cutting Edge Catholics, a podcast of renewal, reconstruction, and resistance. For more information on inclusive Catholicism, please visit extraordinarycatholics.faith. Keep the faith.